Okay. Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to be presenting my work, When Bidders Are DAOs, and this is joint work with Maryam and Tim. And we're all at A16Z Crypto Research, and Tim's also at Columbia. And so to start, one of the motivating examples for this work was Constitution DAO. And so for any of you who aren't familiar, about 2 years ago at this time, one of the copies of the Constitution went up for sale. And the usual way this thing goes is Sotheby's holds an auction, and people submit bids. And it's a kind of standard thing, lots of art auctions, this type of thing. But for the Constitution, there was something special that happened where there was a group of people who thought that the Constitution maybe shouldn't go to a single person to keep in some private collection, but instead should be controlled by some group of people who can decide what to do with it. And so that started, say, a Constitution DAO, where any of these individuals by themselves wouldn't have enough money to be competitive in this very expensive auction. But the idea was, as a collective, maybe they could raise enough money to be competitive. And so in the end, this group ends up raising around $47 million. They still lost, but at least started this interesting idea of how do you sell a public good to a collective of individuals. Yeah, they lost the Ken Griffin, which is not due to some ways the auction was structured and the bid seemed public. But nevertheless, it's still an interesting question of, are there ways you can make mechanisms that are incentive compatible for the people within this group to kind of collectively cost share and win auctions for these public goods? And so one also very important point is that kind of anybody in this group just has some inherent value for their group winning and doesn't particularly care how many other people in the group are also winning the item. So kind of like to give a high-level overview of what our kind of game will look like. So in the first stage, we'll have users kind of just submitting their individual bids to a group. Then we'll have some step in which a group aggregates these individual bids and submits kind of a meta bid to the auctioneer. For example, this could look like the groups just summed individual bids they got from their members. And then we'll have the auctioneer finally picks one of the groups as a winning group and charges that group a payment. And finally, the group has to somehow split that payment across individual users. So for example, this could be a pro rata based off the individual user's initial bids. Okay, so now getting into the formal model. So we'll have kind of a fairly standard game theory, a fairly standard mechanism design model for the agents. We'll have n agents. Each of them has a private value for access. In particular, this value doesn't depend on other agents also getting allocated or not getting allocated the item. We'll have each agent just submits a single non-negative bid to the group. And we'll view this bid as a generic input to a mechanism, but in practice, it'll look like kind of as I showed before, the groups make their input to their own group. Kind of as normal, agents have quasi-linear utilities. So the utility will just be their value if they're granted access minus how much they have to pay. But we'll note that the allocation and payment rules are going to look a bit different structurally compared to the normal setting, just because of this kind of two-level structure of having groups where like groups aggregate bids and make allocations, and then groups separately get allocations from the auctioneer and then make separate payments or charge separate payments back down to the users. And finally, kind of one of the main properties we want is DSIC, where we want to see that agents have a dominant strategy to bid their true values. And now the main part where our model kind of changes from the normal mechanism design setting is this notion of having groups. And so we'll have agents are split across groups where, importantly, agents can only be in one group for our model. And so we'll denote group J by GJ. And groups have three main responsibilities. So the first one is this aggregation step of groups somehow have to turn all of their agents' bids into a single bid that they send to the auctioneer. The groups also have to cost share the payments they're given by an auctioneer back down to their users. And then finally, groups also have to decide which agents get access to the item. And so in particular, since it's a public good that's being sold, the groups are able to grant access to any number of their members if they want to. But there's a free riding problem where if a group is forced to allocate the item to every agent inside of the group, then you might have some member of a group, like you make an epsilon bid, and then if they're forced to gain access, it's incredibly hard to guarantee truthfulness. when people can just make these really cheap bids and then get access if there's other people in the group with very high bids that cover most of the cost. So it's required that our group is public but also excludable, and the group has some way of excluding certain members who make low enough bids to guarantee truthfulness. And then we'll also make this condition that the way the groups aggregate the bids should be such that the central auctioneer should be able to be agnostic for any group level idiosyncrasies. So for example, a group can't simply submit the vector of all the bids it receives. It has to somehow do some aggregation thing where the auctioneer doesn't care if the group's one person or if there are 10 people, they're just running some mechanism between itself. Yeah. So for all the auctioneer knows, each group might as well be an individual person submitting their own private bid. And so there's three properties we want our mechanism to satisfy. So the first one is kind of what I mentioned before, that the mechanism should be incentive compatible and agents should have a dominant strategy to bid their true values. The mechanism should be budget balanced. So basically the amount the auctioneer charges the individual winning group, that group should be able to cover all of that payment between what it charges its users. And finally, to measure how good our mechanism is, we want some notion of an alpha welfare approximation. So we'll say the welfare of any allocation is just the sum of the values of the agents who are granted access. And we achieve an alpha approximation if over all instances, the welfare our mechanism achieves is at least an alpha fraction of what the optimal welfare would have been. And so in this case, the optimal welfare will always be kind of just look at the group with the highest total value and allocate all the items to every member in that group, since we're able to do that. And so it'll kind of be our benchmark that we're trying to match. And so for our results, we'll first introduce some notation of we'll just let k be the size of the largest group, and then hk be the kth harmonic number. And then our first theorem, which is going to be the main focus of this talk, is that we can achieve an HK approximation of the optimal social welfare with a truthful budget balance mechanism. And in fact, this is tight. That we also showed that there is no truthful budget balance mechanism that can achieve better than this HK approximation. Okay, so now getting into the mechanism, we first define this notion of a willingness to pay. And to kind of motivate what this willingness to pay means, our mechanism has a property that every agent that's granted access will pay the exact same amount. And this turns out to just be a requirement for truthfulness, that there's no way, at least for a deterministic mechanism, to charge different agents who are granted access different amounts while still being truthful. And so this basically limits the aggregate bid a group can make by the amount it can split equally amongst some subset of its members. And so we'll call this amount a group's willingness to pay. And so this, for example, will look like the maximum of the group's highest bid, 2 times its second highest bid, 3 times its third highest bid, and so on. And mathematically, if you let the bids be sorted in decreasing order, this is basically the maximum over I of I times bi. So for some concrete examples, if your bid vector was 10, 8, and 4, with just the first bidder, highest bidder, you could cost share 10, with the first 2, 16, with all 3, only 12. And so the willingness to pay of this group looks like 16. The second example, with just the highest bidder, you could cost share 3, with the highest 2, 4, so on. With all 5, you can cost share 5. And yes, the third one, also in this case, you can see with the first 3 bidders, you get the maximum of 9. And so this willingness to pay will be kind of crucial to our mechanism and our analysis. Now going to the actual mechanism itself, so every group will start by aggregating all of its members' bids by calculating its willingness to pay. Then the auctioneer will just simply run a second price auction. So basically the group with the highest willingness to pay will end up winning the auction, and they'll be charged the second highest willingness to pay. And now this winning group finds the largest number of members that can be allocated the item while paying equally. So this is kind of back to the same notion of the group needs to make sure that everybody who wins pays the same amount while still being able to cover the cost it was charged. So if it was charged P, it finds the largest set of members S, such that every member in S has a value at least P over the size of S. And we know we can always find such a set S that satisfies this condition due to how we define willingness to pay. And then finally, the last step is that all of these agents in this group are allocated, or the agents within this set S are all granted access, and they're charged this equal split of the cost. So now just to run through what this might look like in a concrete example, if you look, we have 2 groups where the first group has the bid valuation 10, 6, 5, and 1. The second group has these bids 7, 6, and 3. Then the first group aggregates the bids by calculating its willingness to pay as 15, whereas that's just the first 3 members can cost share the highest amount, and for the second group, it's the first 2 who can cost share the highest amount, so they get a willingness to pay of 12. So the auctioneer picks group 1, charges it the second highest price, which is 12. And now group 1 tries to find the largest subset of agents that can cost share this amount of 12, which ends up being these first 3 agents, since the 4th agent can only cost share a maximum of 4 if they were included. And so then group 1 equally splits up payment 444 and allocates the item or grants access to the item to these first 3 agents. And now just for proofs of truthfulness, so in a single parameter setting, so it suffices to show that our allocation rule is monotone and agents granted access pay the critical bids, where, so for some definitions, a monotone allocation rule just means that if an agent bids more, if an agent is included when they bid some amount, if they bid any higher amount, they're also still granted access. And an agent's critical bid is just the smallest amount they could have bid while still being granted access to the item by the mechanism. And so monotonicity isn't too hard to see. If an agent increases their bid, they can only increase their group's willingness to pay, and they can only increase the amounts that they're able to split equally in the cost share. Seeing the agents pay the critical bid is a bit more challenging, but I'll give this a sketch here. And so the important thing to note is that an agent in the winning group can't change how much their group has to pay by how they bid. Remember, in the mechanism, the amount the winning group has to pay is just the second highest group's willingness to pay, which an agent in their own group can change. And that given the winning group is charged a certain amount, an agents granted access, pay this amount where that payment split over the largest group, they can cover that payment. And so if an agent dropped their bid below that amount, then they wouldn't be included in that largest set anymore. And so they either still have the group winning the item, but be excluded, or maybe if their group's willingness to pay fell from that, then the group might not win at all, and they still wouldn't be winning the item. So just a sketch of how I showed this mechanism is truthful. And then to see the approximation factor, kind of like the core thing that drives it is just this fairly simple inequality that the willingness to pay of a group is at least an HS fraction of that group's total welfare, where S is number of members, and that total welfare is just, again, the sum of the values of the agents within that group. From there, it follows fairly straightforwardly. You can assume that let GJ win the second price auction, and we can see that they'll obtain at least the welfare of their willingness to pay, just because all of the agents kind of within that define that willingness to pay will be able to cover whatever costs that the group is charged. And by individual rationality, that means they at least have they contribute this much in welfare. And then group GJ winning means they have the highest willingness to pay out of any groups. And so if we let the highest welfare group actually have been GJ star, then we have a simple inequality that group J had a higher willingness to pay than group J star. And then we also know by this lemma that group J star's willingness to pay is at least the HK fraction of their welfare, where K is the largest size of any possible group. So that wraps up the main analysis of the theorem. And so he's kind of going to future work. Some things our work didn't cover is what if agents are allowed to be part of multiple groups? What about randomized algorithms? Can we possibly get a better approximation? I'd say at least at this point, it's probably unlikely because a lot of the kind of lower bound follows from lower bounds in truthful cost sharing, and randomized truthful cost sharing doesn't give you, can't do much better than this like this harmonic number bound anyways. Then there's also an interesting question of, is there a middle ground of expanding the group bidding languages that still allows the auctioneer upper mechanism to be group agnostic while getting stronger positive results? So one thing is, like, if you kind of throw away this requirement that the auctioneer can be agnostic to the group, one thing every group could do is just bid this full vector of their kind of members' bids, and the auctioneer could just run VCG and calculate all the payments this way. This kind of defeats the purpose of this like two-level thing where there's an aggregation step. And so there's a kind of a question of, like, is there some middle ground that still lets you get maybe some constant factor approximations or whatnot that's not kind of doesn't allow for full-blown VCG. So yeah, thanks.
Hi, Pranav. Thanks for the talk, and I think it's a very nice paper with very nice results. I have a few questions actually, but maybe I'll start with one. So you model the perspective of the group as a public good, like they get access to the product and pay some payments. Did you think about other settings where it's maybe a divisible thing that they are going to share later? And then
yeah, so kind of asking like, so there's a different model you can make where there's some just like total fixed amount that's splittable, and then like individual agents have some like concave utility over like shares of this total good. So if it's like voting rights or something, maybe this makes sense. So the setting ends up being fairly intractable. So like even if you kind of remove the group setting, and like if you assume there's only one group and they just have to split this divisible item somehow between its agents, there's no like really great mechanisms for that. So there's this like kind of work from a long time ago now by Johari and Siklis on this like resource sharing stuff. And like you kind of can run VCG, but like really you can just show that there's like equilibria between the users competing. But once like users start competing within their own group, it gets very messy. Of like users have to reason about like I like want to bid enough that like I'm making sure my group wins, but I also want to bid enough that like I'm competing against other people inside my group. So we thought about this a bit, but I don't think there's anything super clean you can get out of that model. But it's an interesting direction to go down, definitely. Yeah.
So I guess you started with this motivation of Constitution DAO, and part of the story was that because the DAO was organized on chain, Ken Griffin knew that they had 42 million in the bank, so he bid like 42.5 million or whatever.
Yeah.
That you've not modeled this privacy, and did you have thoughts on that, or is that like you just view that as a technical problem and not one that's incentive-based?
Yeah, I mean, it's like not super. I mean, I think there's enough cryptography you can do to get around that. Like, nice thing is if your mechanism actually is truthful and that people don't have to care about whether people are bidding, then you could imagine like an extreme thing is everybody makes just like commitments to their bids or something, and then like the group makes some commitment without knowing its actual bid to what that is, and then the auction ends and you reveal the commitment. So kind of like extending the like optimal credible stuff. I mean, so like yeah, so I guess like we're even ignoring like all notions of credibility, right? So it's like it's not a second price auction obviously is incredible and all this stuff. So you can probably throw enough cryptography at it to like fix that problem, but it's a question of like what's the actual right UX thing to do that's still optimal and while balancing those concerns.
Yeah, so another question I wanted to ask is, in the perspective of the upper mechanism designer, I mean, do you have thoughts on how he could enforce the lower level mechanism to match? I mean, you're thinking about designing both the upper level and the lower level mechanisms so they can work together to maximize welfare. But maybe you don't have control over the lower mechanism. So in this case, maybe you want to take a lower, worst case approach for the upper mechanism designer.
Yeah, so I think like one kind of nice thing is that like for an agent's notion of like truthfulness within their group, they don't actually care what other groups are doing per se. Or like as like if the upper mechanism is running a second price auction, and I know like my group is doing this like equal cost sharing thing, I don't particularly care if the second group is like running some weird first price like combination or something, because like as long as the upper auction second price, then like the group faces the posted price basically, then they have to cost share somehow. And so like I think like you could, so I think in that sense like it's not particularly important that like the upper auction, like you can't enforce both levels are the same. I think like it's there's also like different ways to interpret what the lower mechanism even means. So like in a Web3 sense, maybe like there's really a smart contract that like is enforcing these rules or something. You could also imagine just like it's for like an off-chain context of doing this type of stuff. maybe it like literally just means that like there's some negotiating thing that happens within the group of how people will pay, and that this like equal cost sharing is actually just like the output of whatever that negotiating process was. It wasn't like a literal mechanism. And so in that sense, there's a couple of different ways to interpret what having a different lower and upper mechanism is. But I mean, I think it is interesting to like see what different combinations of lower and upper mechanisms you can use and how that changes the different outcomes in the end.
Okay, so for the sake of time, we'll move to the next speaker. And thank you, Pranav, for a wonderful talk.